Welcome back to Read 508, Week 3. We were talking, this is Part 2, Screencast 2, and we were talking about the different aspects of the reading process. So we covered just sensory and perceptual aspects. So let's talk a little bit about sequential aspects. And I hit on that a little bit in that previous discussion. But essentially, students must follow the sequence of the material that's printed on the page. So they need to know that we read from left to right, that you go from top to bottom, that you go from the front to the back of the book. Kids, they learn this from watching and having experience with text and with printed material. So if you ever watch a toddler who's read too frequently or comes from a house where they read a lot, they can do all of these things, right? Sometimes they'll take their finger, and even though they can't read, they kind of swish their finger across the bottom of the page. They generally will figure out how to hold the book correctly, that you open up that cover, that you look at each page, and that you turn the pages in sequential order. Those of you that teach pre-K or kindergarten, this is what we assess when we use that concepts about print assessment or CAP. You actually see, do kids know how to hold the book? Do they know how to open the book? Do they look at the words printed on the bottom of the page and move their finger from left to right? Can they point to an individual word? Can they point to the title? So all of those things dealing with the sequential aspects of the reading act. They also understand that there's a logic to reading and that there's a link between oral and written language, and readers need to understand what this link is, and that the printed words follow the same grammatical logic that we use in our oral language. So having an understanding of that in oral language is going to facilitate the reading process. If students have processing issues where they have trouble with that orally, they will have trouble with it reading as well. They touched a little bit on kind of some of the challenges that new media can bring with this idea of hypertext, and that you can click on something in the middle and it takes you to new information and it links you to different places. But generally still, when you look at digital media, it follows a lot of the same rules about sequence, but we need to also kind of figure out that students, particularly emergent readers and students who are still in the learning to read phase, need to be taught specifically the use of hypertext and hypermedia and hyperlinking, and how they need to be able to then go back to kind of finish their comprehension loop, right? And then as kids get older, and sometimes it's in children's books, but particularly as they make the shift from narrative text to expository text, the idea that there's sidebars and different levels and headings and other places that you get information from, and students sometimes need to be taught, in what sequence do you access that information, whether it's print on a textbook page or whether they're looking at it digitally. So there's the aspect then of students' experiential background, right? So everybody has schemata, and schemata is essentially, how information and concepts are clustered in your brain. So everybody's schemata is a little bit different, and sometimes when you talk about this idea of tapping students' schema or tapping their prior knowledge, we're talking about having students access the information that they already have and make connections and associations with the new information. So the associations that students or readers will make between the textual information is based on their schema or their schemata. So it's based on the experiences and the prior knowledge that they have. And this is what helps them interpret the message. So if you think back to that apple pie example, right? So it's important to remember too that there can be cultural differences. So cultural differences in what type of schemata you have, the experiences that you have, or the associations that you make with certain ideas, concepts, or words. Experiential background is kind of also the reason why readers are often more interested and take more away from text that they make connections to, right? So if you have been to certain places, or you know some information about the topic, or you've had a similar experience, you're more likely to be able to use your experiential background or use your schemata to help you interpret and understand that text. So as teachers, we know that students sometimes struggle, or we struggle with our students, when students bring very little topical or content related background to a particular piece of text. And so figuring out first what information they do bring with them, and how we can maybe make the connection to that text, but sometimes that's really difficult to do. And so then providing them with some of that background information, and so students can get or build their schemata by having two different kinds of experiences. And so obviously direct experience with the reading content is most helpful, because that means that the student or the reader actually did that. So they have direct experience, so they've actually been to that place or they've done that thing. Vicarious or an indirect experience can also be important, and sometimes that's what you can provide or build for your students. And those can be, I know someone that did it, I saw pictures of X, Y, or Z, I went on a field trip, I watched a movie, so those types. But that all of those experiences really help build a student's kind of clusters of conceptual information that they have in their brain, and then being able to tap those and use that experiential background aids in them really pulling as much from the text as they can. So we said reading is thinking, right? So reading is a thinking process, and this is what we spend a lot of time teaching in school, particularly as we move kind of out of second grade and into third and beyond. Or if you teach at the community college level, you spend tons of time on the thinking piece behind reading. So you have to think when you read. I liked this little picture or little journal entry from a fourth grade student, and she distinguished the difference between what she called real reading and fake reading. So when you're really reading, you're focused on the book, you're thinking about the reading, you read every page, you stay in one spot, you have a steady pace, you check for your understanding, and you read silently. And fake reading would be the book is not in front of you, maybe you're chatting or you're whispering to somebody, you have wandering eyes, you have drifting thoughts, you might be moving around, you're reading too fast or too slow, you have your book in the wrong position. These are all indicators of not really reading. Your eyes are closed, obviously, would be quite a big indication that you are not reading, but that there's no thinking or checking for understanding. And so I like the idea that she had this idea of checking her understanding and thinking about reading in both of these examples. You're either doing it or you're not. So, they're thinking not just about kind of the comprehension piece, but you're thinking even in recognizing and interpreting that graphophonic relationship that we talked about before. But we want students to question the text, to make inferences, to be able to ask those questions and to monitor their own comprehension. And this is, as teachers, we can ask questions to help them guide their thinking, and we can go into those explicit strategies during our instruction. But getting those right questions is really important, right? So we know that poor questions can limit thinking as well. And we're going to spend a ton more time on this piece, but this is really just the overview. So reading is learning, right? So the saying is, reading must be learned. Reading is a means to learn. Learn to read so that you can read to learn. So effective readers essentially are, they're more successful in school and all of their academic subjects, and they can also find enjoyment in reading. So if you've heard of that Matthew effect, right, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, students who struggle to read, as they move up in their grades, they learn far less in terms of academic content than their more able reading peers, right? So students that are much better readers learn more, and they learn faster. When you learn faster, you can learn more. So the students that struggle more, and the students that don't struggle get even further ahead. And so that gap really becomes even wider as students move up if they're not great readers. That associational process, right? So first, kind of associating the objects and the ideas with the words, associating the spoken word with the written word, um, the objects and the ideas with the written words, and then again that graphophonic relationship. So, associating those phonemes with the grapheme. So kind of the more meaningful or the more complex or the more depth there is to the association, they'll learn faster and they'll learn more. So this applies from even just kind of these emergent skills for reading in terms of making associations to the more advanced skills. So, as students start to apply kind of their experiential background, the stronger the associations, the faster they learn. So that's why it's so important for us to kind of consider these when we're engaging students in the reading process. And then there's the affective aspects of reading. And so this idea of interest and attitude and motivation and self-concept really help determine the question of, will students persist in a reading task? And in particular, will students persist in a reading task that challenges them? Whether that challenge be the complexity of the text itself in terms of the words and the phrases that are used in it, or if the challenge presented is one of experiential background or schemata. So if students do not have a lot of background knowledge to bring to the text, their interest, their motivation, and their self-concept will help determine whether or not they're going to persist in that task and they're going to get the information or comprehend that text. So that motivation piece is super important, which is, how motivated are they to engage in this task? What is their interest in the topic? What is their interest in the task? Are they fluent is a really important consideration too. Can they get through that text itself at least? Can they read it fluently rather than disfluently? And then their efficaciousness for that task. So kind of there's how they view themselves as a reader, and then in particular how they view themselves as a reader in terms or a learner in terms of being able to understand the topic that's being presented in the text. So all of these affective aspects work together, and kind of by themselves, they're all necessary to be able to engage successfully in a reading task, but they're what we call necessary, but not sufficient. So just being motivated isn't sufficient enough to successfully get you through the task. Just feeling efficacious about how yourself as a reader or a learner is not enough to get you through the task. And just having a good attitude about reading isn't enough. You also need all those other pieces. But on the same token, if you're not interested and you have a poor low self-efficacy for the task, and you have a poor attitude towards reading, you're probably not going to persist in that task, particularly when it's difficult. And then lastly, there's these constructive aspects. And so rightfully so, this is the last aspect, because this is really where you put all of that information together and the reader constructs kind of their individual and personal meanings from that text. So you put together the sensory and the perceptual aspects, their experiential background, their affective characteristics, and students can kind of derive different meaning from the same text, but they get at their personal meaning for that text. All right, so this was just kind of, like I said, like an overview of all of those elements or aspects of the reading process, and we're going to spend more time on all of these pieces this semester. So let's move into Screencast 3, and in Screencast 3, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the theories of the reading process.